Why are the Welsh always revolting? I mean, the Brits were so unimpressed with them, they said, and I quote, "The Welsh are ignorant, barbaric, primitive, unclean, immoral, indecent, and an impediment to British progress." Okay, we're going back a century or so here, but still, that's not very kind. But if the Brits thought they could insult the Welsh into submission, they were very, very wrong. Because by the 19th century, the Welsh had well earned, their deserved reputation of being a nation of dissenters. Non-conformity was the label given, and the Welsh embraced it. And we're going to see why this history of Welsh non-conformity is so well deserved. Hi, I'm Justine, the nerdy half of the Breakaway Bravehearts. And after 5 months in Wales, I have come to respect the independent Welsh streak. These people are pretty good at finding their own way of doing things. So today I'm doing a deep dive into that Welsh cultural strength by taking the example of how religion and belief systems have developed here. Because I was surprised to learn that Wales has the highest ratio of churches per capita in the United Kingdom. And yet it was within the church that the Welsh first earned that label of non-conformists. I wanted to learn, how did the Welsh turn out to be such religious rebels? So I went back as far as I could possibly go. This isn't just any burial site, it's one of the finest passage tombs in Wales and a window into the lives and beliefs of Neolithic people. Bryn Celli Ddu shows us the importance of burial and ancestor worship to the ancient Britons. The site was carefully constructed with a long stone passage that led to an inner burial chamber. One of the most fascinating features is the tomb's alignment with the summer solstice. Many cultures built monuments aligned with solstices or equinoxes, but what sets Bryn Celli Ddu apart and ties it distinctly to Welsh spirituality is how these ancient sacred spaces continued to be used throughout the centuries. Many sacred Welsh sites, including churches, were built on spaces where there had already been some kind of spiritual connection, such as this one. Their rituals don't seem to have been set in stone either. There were fire ceremonies, sealing rituals, and different ways of handling the dead, like an ongoing conversation between old and new beliefs. Practices that still take place today that many of us connect with Christianity, such as pilgrimage, actually have their roots in the spirituality of these days. This would have been a place of pilgrimage for those who lived in the areas around as they came together every summer solstice. The ancient practice of journeying to sacred sites for blessing, healing, or spiritual connection was essentially adapted into the Christian framework, keeping alive that impulse to connect with sacred places. And when you stand in places like the summit of Cwyfan, in the hills behind Melding and Prestatyn, it's easy to see why the ongoing generations would have felt that spiritual connection to the land. Thousands of years after the Neolithic peoples, but still centuries before the arrival of the Romans, local people farmed these hills and built roundhouses on the land below. And these homes likely held communities led by Druids, priests and spiritual leaders that were central to the Welsh Celtic religion. Druids weren't just religious figures, they were judges, teachers, holders of sacred knowledge. Their rituals were closely tied to nature, including sacred groves of trees, rivers, and the cycles of the stars. They worshipped gods of the natural world. But then the Romans arrived, and sites like this Roman bath showed they really made their home here in Wales. And that meant importing their customs and their gods too. This led to a fascinating collision of spiritual worlds. The Romans didn't just come in and wipe out all the local gods. Instead, you could worship simultaneously. So you might worship your Celtic gods while your neighbours worshipped their Roman gods, and it was okay for a little while. Sometimes they even happily shared the same sacred spots. Archaeological evidence shows, especially in Anglesey, There are places where you can find Celtic ritual horse gear and Roman horse gear all in the same place, the same spiritual, sacred place. But the blending was not without tension for long. The Romans did start to believe they could just impose their ideas through their power, their might. And this led to the infamous destruction of the sacred oaks of the Druids. The Druids were heavily and violently persecuted by the Romans. The Romans said that the Druids practiced abhorrent things like human sacrifice. I mean, obviously, you can't just randomly sacrifice people, unless, of course, it's for entertainment purposes and there's a lion and a large audience involved. There's a pretty cool pop culture connection here with the Asterix and Obelix comics. You probably know them, right? Those funny stories about the small village resisting the Romans with a little help from a magic potion. You must remember Getafix, or in the original French he's called Panoramix. He's the village druid who brews the magic potion that gives the Gauls their strength. In Asterix in Britain, Asterix and Obelix travel to Roman-occupied Britain to help a local village fight off the invaders with some of their strength-giving potion. Spoiler alert, things go wrong and they end up having to give the Brits tea instead of the potion, but that turns out to be the key to British success. While it's all fictional and of course played up for laughs, it actually taps into some real history. Druids were a big deal back in the day. And the whole idea of small Celtic groups using magic to stand up to the Romans, that's rooted in truth. That did happen, especially here in North Wales. The Romans saw Druids as a real threat, especially on Anglesey, a hotspot for Druidic power and Celtic resistance. Roman historian Tacitus tells us how Druids tried, often successfully, to intimidate Roman troops with wild rituals and spells. It was a strength that the Romans were scared of, physically and spiritually. That's why the Romans had such a problem with the Druids. They could sense their power, and they knew they needed to eliminate that quickly. So even though Asterix and Obelix aren't exactly history books, they do an awesome job of capturing the spirit of what life must have been like back then. Plus, they've helped a lot of people get curious about Celtic history and those ancient spiritual tensions between native beliefs and Roman rule. And of course, we're all curious about the fairies. Well, at least we should be if we want to stay safe in the forest. When Christianity seeped into Wales, the old ways didn't disappear, kind of just transformed. One group for certain you are not going to get rid of were the fairies. Over the centuries, locals have been able to make their peace with the fairies, and some communities have found ways to live together harmoniously. This is appropriately named the fairy tree, and it is the largest fairy dwelling in Prestatyn. This fairy condominium houses quite a range of different fairy apartments. It reaches all the way almost to the top of the tree. It's basically a multi-story apartment building that houses both fairies and their pet butterflies. It's important to understand that this is not an actual fairy tree. This is a homage to fairies, and it's based on Disney and media stereotypes. And we need to remember that fairies come in all different shapes and sizes with all different personalities. Welsh fairies in particular are least like your everyday sparkly winged Disney characters. Sure, you'll find similar fairy tales across Britain, but the Welsh fairies have their own distinct names, personalities. They can be beautiful and enchanting, and they're also powerful and unpredictable. The Welsh forest is one of those places where you can still feel that old belief seeping up through the ground. Tylwyth Teg, or the Fair family, live in the forests, the lakes and the mountains. Don't think about your cartoons or your Tinkerbells. These are hardcore beings. They are beautiful and graceful, but also tricky and dangerous if you cross them. Fairies were woven into every part of Welsh life. Forest fairies in particular were the guardians of the natural world, deeply connected to ancient groves and sacred woods. That's where the boundary between our world and the other world is the thinnest. These fairies can be playful and helpful to those who respect the forest, but they can also be mischievous and fiercely protective. This is why, when walking through a Welsh wood, it is important to know proper fairy etiquette. Rule number 1, do not step into a ring of mushroom. This is a fairy dancing ring and you do not want to enter it. You're likely to be whisked away into the fairy world for what might seem like a few moments to you, but is really years in human terms. Number 2, always show respect to the forest and its spirits. Avoid damaging trees or polluting streams, or you will be punished with misfortune or illness. And number 3, do not whistle or sing in the woods. This is bound to attract mischievous fairies. One way to stay safe is to bring some offering. Milk or bread is most preferred, so make sure you've got some stacked away in your backpack there. If not, gather some wildflowers as you go. Just have these prepared as gifts so that you can make an offering, a peace giving, and just keep yourself out of trouble. However, and this is very important to remember, this is not a reciprocal custom. You must never accept food or drink offered to you by fairies. It will bind you to their realm. You might want to practice some polite refusals to keep yourself safe, and never ever take anything from a fairy ring. That is at minimum a curse, maximum penalty, sudden death. Salt is also highly recommended. You want to add this just like you would take a first aid kit on your tramp. You want to keep salt around you at all times. When you're at home in a Welsh home, just sprinkle it around your doorway or on your mat as to guard off from evil spirits entering. But while out hiking, just gather it around. Maybe once you camp over at night, you want to make a circle of salt around your campfire or your tent to keep those evil fairies at bay. I'm pretty sure I found the remnants of a fairy party here. I would say there was some kind of either a celebration or conference of some kind discussing the environmental concerns that humans are now placing upon the fairies. I don't want to touch it, I don't want to disturb it. It may be arrayed in some kind of sacred manner, but yeah, let's move away and leave this fairy environment. And yeah, I've got to go and grab some salt or something now, just in case I've already done something. Yeah, I'm actually a little bit scared. Let's move on. Did you hear that? Now, we're not talking about children's stories here. This was the way that you understood the world. Traditional Welsh life was deeply connected to nature and the unseen, and understanding both the natural and spiritual world was an important part of a Welsh education. In fact, once you've gained mastery over all the different elements and the minerals and the plants that you needed to understand in the natural world, then you might consider becoming a wise woman for your career. Wise women were respected for their knowledge and their ability to support you with both natural medicines and spiritual guidance, although I'm not sure they were covered by the NHS. If wise woman was in your career path, you had to be in the know. There wasn't just some kind of training ground or school you could apply for. You needed a role model, a mentor. Usually this would be a family member, but you might, if you were lucky, be able to apprentice yourself to a veteran wise woman who wanted to pass on her knowledge. In your application form, you want to stress that you not only have an interest in the science of nature, but also that you have a keen memory, because everything was passed on through the oral tradition. You were going to have to learn by listening to a lot of stories, and there were a lot of rules you had to remember. Some plants could only be gathered at certain times of the night in certain phases of the moons, and you had to know which one. For example, plants like mugwort or St. John's wort should be harvested during the full moon, because that's when the power is the strongest. You see, nature's rhythm affects the potency and the spirit of the plant, so timing really matters. And speaking of time, we're now heading into the 5th and 6th centuries CE. This era saw old beliefs persist and adapt with these new evolving ideas about one God, his morals and his rules of life. slowly reshaping Welsh spirituality, sometimes in surprising ways. So most of these surprises came in the 500 to 700 AD, in what became known as the Age of the Saints, when Wales was negotiating some very turbulent waters. It was a violent period, with a lot of political fragmentation and warfare, and a flood of cultural change. And we can learn how different Welsh leaders negotiated these churning waters through the story of one of the founding Christian towns of North Wales, a little place called Dissenters. Actually, the water metaphor is kind of inappropriate because the name of this town actually comes from the Latin word for desert, but its other meaning is hermitage, refuge, because this once was, so it's said, the centre of Christianity for northeast Wales. This little town is even mentioned in the Domesday Book as Dizard. It really was an established and important religious site before the Norman conquest. Many early Welsh saints in this region came from noble or princely families. Amongst all this chaos, many warriors and princes made some surprising choices. Rather than continue this endless cycle of battles and political struggles, they pulled back and decided the best way to lead their people into peace was through a spiritual path. They became monks and preachers. Their monasteries became places of learning, art, and a sanctuary in this violent world. They offered education and structure when political systems were fragile. One way to do that was very clever. Instead of building churches on completely new land, early Christians just placed their church right on top the existing pagan holy grounds. This meant that the sacred landscape was not erased but transformed. You get a lot of chapels that are fed by waterfalls or springs because they're built in spaces that already held pagan spirituality. So according to my research, I should be able to find medieval crosses here because this graveyard is said to be full of the rich history of the region. You're supposed to have burials of Vikings, of Normans, of Welsh and English, all highlighting that mix that created the nation. I couldn't tell you which was which. Obviously, the earliest ones are a little bit worn now anyway. So the earliest date I can read is 1851. But these guys here are very sunken now and you can't read any inscription at all. So I'm guessing they've been here a while. But the point is, this has been sacred ground for a very, very long time. Christianity didn't come in and just place itself on top and erase the past. It sort of just kind of merged and reinvented itself as it went along. So because Disseth already was a place of sacred water, those myths were just built upon and added into the Christian story. When Christianity entered Wales, it needed to win the hearts and minds of the people. And the best way to do that is to bring along the stories that they were already attached to. While this tactic was clever and successful, it wasn't always peaceful or cooperative. So sometimes you might have the ancient well of a sacred pagan god suddenly turn into the holy well of Saint so-and-so. It was more just a direct takeover. Even the Welsh word for church, clan, you can find in the names of some of these towns from their pre-Christian naming because they were already sacred ground. But these spiritual colonists hadn't counted on tough, determined Welsh independence. They should have known by now. When people try to change the Welsh, they push back loud and clear. Now we're at a truly special spot, St. Cwyfan's Church, often called the Little Church in the Sea. It's on a tiny tidal island on the coast of Anglesey, and it dates back to the 12th century, but it's likely been a Christian place of worship as far back as the 7th century. Its location alone tells a story of spiritual isolation and resilience. It was originally built on a peninsula, but erosion has cut it off from the mainland. Welsh Christianity, like that at St. Cwyfan's, developed a very distinct character over the centuries. Unlike the tightly run Roman Church, the Welsh Christian community was mainly run from small monastic hubs. organised by local abbots from noble families, and these held on to their unique Welsh traditions, even had Easter at a different time of the year. This difference persisted and was fiercely defended by the Welsh clergy, even as most of Europe adopted the Roman system. The historian Bede, in 731, criticised the Welsh for holding on to what he called their own bad customs. Most Welsh communities resisted, quietly but persistently. They openly carried on, still maintaining the worship of their local saints in parallel and combining their local traditions and language with the Christian services. But sometimes the pressure became too great and it started to get dangerous, and communities had to go underground and be secretive about their local Welsh traditions while maintaining a public look of Roman Christianity. As English rule grew, English-speaking priests were placed in Welsh communities. They couldn't speak the language and they did not carry on the traditions. This didn't go down well, especially here in this church, when in the 18th century, the Bishop of Bangor appointed Dr. Thomas Bowles to lead this congregation of Welsh speakers. The community rebelled and they refused to come to services or cooperate with Bowles, and eventually there was legal and public challenge. So by the 18th century, the Welsh had well earned their reputation as rebels. To the established church, their resistance to religious control had become so deeply rooted that they started to use the label Non-conformity as a formal identity, referring to all those who would not comply with the established church's rule. This was far from worrying for the Welsh. In fact, they totally embraced the term, using it as a symbol of pride. Affirmation they were on the right track with their unique brand of faith that rejected imposed authority and celebrated local autonomy. By the mid-19th century, Wales was predominantly non-conformist, with chapels sprouting up so regularly they shaped entire settlements. We're here at the Methodist Church in Prestatyn. As Wales industrialised, faith followed the people into the towns and the valleys. Non-conformist chapels became the heart of the community, called citadels of dissent. They were the centre not just of religion, but of political and social life. So many started to spring up all over the place that they were actually reshaping the whole landscape. In fact, even the name Prestatyn derives from the Old English priosta, the plural of priest, combined with homestead, thus means the home of the priests. There are 7 churches active in this one main street town. Wales overall has 1 church per 670 people, which is double the UK average. Then, from the 1960s onwards, with the rise of individualism, science and skepticism, Wales pushed further and further towards secularism. Wales today is living through some pretty big changes when it comes to faith and spirituality. For the first time ever, less than half of the people here say that they're Christian, and nearly as many say they don't follow any religion at all. Religious education has been replaced by a new subject called Religion, Values and Ethics. It's pluralistic and inclusive, but Wales is still a place with a deep spiritual heart. The common thread through all of Wales' history isn't rebellion for the sake of it. It's about keeping a personal, deep connection to place, language and community, no matter what comes from the outside. The Welsh have never really just accepted ideas without putting their own little spin on them, and quite rightly so. When outsiders have attempted to impose or import beliefs, Welsh faith has just bent, reshaped, and sometimes just ignored them. Sure, you get religious dissent and non-conformity in other places too, but what makes Wales stand out is how their faith became a cultural symbol of pride and resistance. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of spirituality in Wales. I found it fascinating. I'm going to be doing some more deep dives. Let me know if there's a topic that you're interested in. Just pop it in the description below because I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts. I'm not sure where I'm off to next time. It'll be a surprise to both of us. Wherever it is, I hope I'll see you there. Until then, happy travels everyone.